Pete, I need to ask you some questions about Rene LaRocque. He told me he doesn't believe Ted Salas sold that land.
Not many who knew Ted do.
What about you?
Ted Salas was my elder. He knew this land was sacred. When Shist took it, drove his pumps into it, ran his pipes through it, it was the end. Our stories will die with me.
Hey, come on. Pete, listen to me. You're not dying anytime soon.
Do you remember when I took you to the dark water as a child, Terry?
I remember I was scared.
Yes. It is full of magic. Both light and dark. Our most powerful guardian spirit lives in the dark water. It protects what our ancestors called the nexus of all realities. The guardian has become very angry. For the blood spilled, it seeks blood.
Pete, I'm a cop. I can't believe in Indian spirits and magic.
What you believe doesn't matter. You're not from this place. You're not from any place.
Where's Ted Salas, Pete? Is he the one killing people?
Kyle, wait!
Is he killing people with or without Renee?
Kyle, I didn't bring you here to do this.
Maybe he is in the swamp. Maybe the swamp is in him.
Whoever or whatever is out there, Pete. I saw it.
What did you see?
I don't know.
You know what you saw. It is chosen who will die.
Who? Who will die, Pete?
Everyone.
Welcome to the Superhero Cinephiles podcast. I'm your host, Perry Constantine, and welcoming a new guest today, and that is Daniel. Daniel, how you doing today?
Hey, man, doing wonderful. How about you?
I'm doing pretty good. Maybe not so good after we start jumping into the movie for today, but we'll get there.
Well, thanks.
But before we get too much into that, why don't you tell people a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, well, hello, everyone. Absolute pleasure to be here. My name is Dan. I am not as cool as a lot of your guests that I've heard on some episodes. I've heard some professors and some doctors and a cool comic creator so far. So there's definitely, I'm up quite against quite a bit there, but I'm okay with that. I'm just a podcaster. I do a podcast, a weekly podcast called All New, All Different #1 Comics, where my co-host and I review a brand new comic book each week that comes out into local comic book shops, and we talk comic news and all of that. I also do a bi-weekly podcast that's movies. It's called Real Good Movies with Jer and Dan. So that's pretty much where I am. Huge comic collector, but nothing professional in the field like you and most of your guests. So.
Well, you got quite a backdrop there. So we don't do video on the show, but we do it when we're recording. And so people who are listening, he's got like all these different comics mounted on the wall behind him. I see a New Mutants poster there and some Marvel Legends figures. So definitely got a nice little backdrop going.
Yeah, I'm a big collector. Been collecting since I was around 8 years old. Got really big into that first Robin mini series and then just escalated from there. Got big into Turtles and then Marvel stuff and everything. So yeah, I have a nice gigantic collection, have a lot of toys, have a lot of graded books, have all kind of stuff. Hope to open my own comic book shop in a few more years. So That's where
I was going to say your backdrop kind of looks like a comics shop already.
it was a virtual one for a little while. I did
Mm.
some online selling on like Pop Shop and whatnot. So
So you mentioned that when you were 8, you got into collecting with the first Robin miniseries. That was the Tim Drake one back in the late '80s, early '90s.
yep.
So how did you get into comics? Why did you end up? Why did that end up being your first comic?
So such a weird story. When I was around that age, my grandfather was kind of, I don't know, he was reaching the end of his life, to put it nicely, I guess, and he was starting to find like little things around to give to his kids and grandkids and stuff like that, starting to kind of finalize his will and all of those things. He had a really big coin collection, big coin collector. So he decided to pass those coins down to me. I lived in a neighborhood where I was able to ride my bike to this cool little coin shop, and right across the street from the coin shop was a comic book store. So I would go take my coins, kind of one by one or whatever, to this coin shop, and then get a nice 10, 15, $20, go over to the comic shop and buy some comic books. Kind of that Robin mini series was fresh on the newsstands right then, and I don't know, it just looked so cool and flashy to me. I've never, believe it or not, I've never been a huge Batman fan, but I do really like DC stuff a lot. So I like a lot of the Batman villains and tie-in characters and stuff. Just not huge on Batman himself. For some reason, Robin just spoke to me.
Mm-hmm.
Me and my cousin were obsessed. We dressed up like Robin for Halloween like 4 years in a row, and just kind of took off from there. So
That's awesome. Yeah, then that was Tim Drake. That was my Robin too. That growing up, always still my favorite Robin to this day. Like I like Damian, I like Jason and Dick, but it'll always be Tim. It will always be the favorite.
Well, at least you like Damian. I can't say the same thing, but I and that's the one we're gonna get apparently. So
That's the one we're getting. Yeah. Well, we'll see what they do, how they play around with it, because you probably know, but in the series when he was introduced, Tim was already Robin at the time, so maybe they'll have some back and forth. We'll see how it all plays out.
yeah,
I'm hoping anyway, because
sure.
we're getting a version of him on Titans right now, although that's ending soon. So, but I was glad that we got him for at least a little bit.
Yeah. Hey, I'll take what I can get. Anything that's not DC that's just going to be canceled 2 years from now or rebooted or whatever, that's fine. So,
so you didn't have any association with Robin before that comic book, like not from like the Batman 66 show or anything like that. It was just you saw the comic and it kind of appealed to you, type of thing.
oh yeah, it was definitely just walking into the shop and seeing that comic and thinking, I don't know, I guess probably that was the youngest hero I could identify with. That's probably the only thing I can think of. And again, being on that opposition of thinking, hey, I really like some of these characters. I really like the villains that they're going up against, but I don't like the dude dressed up in the bat suit. So who else is there?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's pretty cool, because most people who end up getting into Batman or Batman related characters usually have that entry point from somewhere else first. Not often these days you find someone whose entry point was actually the comic, so that's pretty cool.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely a little different.
So and that led you to into DC and to then Marvel. And tell us a little bit about your podcast and what you guys do on there. And I know you kind of talked about them a little bit, but how did they kind of start up? And tell us a little bit more about them, type of thing.
Sure. Well, it had been a huge dream of mine to get into podcasting. I love just sitting around and talking. I love talking about movies, comic books, all of those things, music, whatever. I'm a huge, really big into all that kind of nerdy culture stuff. There's not always a large group of people to talk about it around my area, at least, given my age. Like I'm at the end of my 30s, so it's kind of, you don't find a lot of people who want to talk about comic books or whatever, at least around here.
Right.
So it always been like a really big dream of mine to be able to just sit around, record conversations about comic books first and foremost, but also movies and things of that nature. So I just happened to be browsing around, looking at forums, looking at Reddit, looking at anywhere I could to see people who were looking for a co-host for any type of podcast that I thought might be interested in. And I found a guy my co-host named Jer who wanted to start the Real Good Movies podcast, and he just wanted to talk about movies. He didn't have any real, I don't know, anything like really fleshed out. In the world of podcasting, you usually have to find like a niche or something.
Mm-hmm.
And he was just like, "Hey, I just want to talk about movies. I don't really care what we talk about, whatever." And I was like, "Well, that sounds great. I love movies. I love genre film, whatever." He's more into, he likes genre film and all of that as well, but he's definitely more into the award-winning movies and stuff like that. So I figured we'd be a really good balance on one another. I'm not really into that kind of stuff. I
Mm-hmm.
famously hate The Godfather and things like that,
Really?
and would rather watch like a Kevin Smith movie or something instead. So I thought we'd have like a cool balance with one another, and we do. We have a great dynamic with that. We kind of see things differently and then are able to see eye to eye on certain things. So anyways, that's where I started. I got into podcasting that way. That was kind of his podcast idea that he brought me into, and I'm the co-host of, and it's great and I love it more than anything. But again, like I really wanted to be able to branch out on my own, have my own podcast, edit it myself, do all of the
Mm-hmm.
work, uploading, all of that stuff. So I got into this I got this idea to do a comic book podcast where I would take a brand new comic book each week and kind of review it. I actually got really lucky because I work with a guy who's really into comic books, so I talked to him about the idea and he loved it. So we ended up making this happen, and we kind of just started out. We just released our 4th episode. So this one's a brand new podcast, but I just wanted to be able to talk about comics and break them down. I really
Mm-hmm.
love the Comic Vine podcast that ended a few years ago. I listened to Comic Book Club and The Stack and all of that. I listened to a lot of different comic book podcasts. I find it hard to find a podcast that really focuses on breaking down issues that are coming out that week and really going
Mm-hmm.
depth and talking about them. So that's what we decided to do on our podcast.
That's cool. Yeah, what I wish I could find more comic book podcasts, but my whole thing is I read by trades, and I typically only get them when they're on sale. So most of the comic book podcasts they talk about, they're focusing on single issues a lot. So if I try to listen to it, then I'll end up getting the stuff spoiled months before I can actually read it.
Yeah,
That's why I like. But we've had host of Digging for Kryptonite. That's a great Superman podcast that is going back and like doing stuff a lot that is easier for me to access, and so I don't feel as spoiled when I read those type when I listen to that one.
sure. There's some really good ones out there. I don't know if Jay and Miles are still doing the Explain the X-Men podcast or not. I listened to that for a while and it was really great. Kind of went into a lot of the Uncanny X-Men stuff and then the spinoffs, and then went really deep into New Mutants, which was really cool. It's one of my
Mhm.
favorite series. But yeah, I like ones that are able to kind of take that deep dive and really explain something.
Yeah, absolutely. So what are some of the best comics you've read recently then?
Oh God. Well, I just read new #1 that came out from Dark Horse, Where Monsters Lie. Phenomenal comic book. I think it's just going to be a 5-part mini, but it is so insanely good. I've actually been kind of like digging back into the deep catalog. I haven't been reading too much new stuff other than the stuff that I'm reviewing. So I've been going back to Kevin Smith's run on Daredevil. I love that. I can read
That's a
that
good one.
anytime. I just love to pop in and out of Uncanny X-Men. I don't even care where. It doesn't even matter to me. In the 100s, go all the way back to the 450s or whatever. There's some great stuff in there. I'm always down for reading New Mutants, and then of course I suggested Man Thing because that's one of my absolute favorite comic books of all time. I love reading Man Thing. I probably try to go back and read a Man Thing comic book at least every other week or so. Um, I really love all the classic runs on Man Thing. I even like the horrible like R.L. Stein run. I
Mhm.
can, yeah, I can get down on all of that stuff. So that's kind of the stuff I've been reading lately. I have been really enjoying the Dark Web Amazing Spider-Man stuff that's been going on. The Wonder Woman stuff over at DC has been really great. So that's kind of where I've been with comics lately.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I just finished reading the I think it was the second volume of that Spider-Man run. That's Zeb Wells, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, yeah. I just finished reading the second run of the after the Beyond stuff, the second run of the second book in the Beyond, after the post Beyond era.
Oh,
And I
okay.
enjoy it. I'm looking forward to seeing what comes next in it. But like you mentioned, also I'd had that same type of thing where kind of one of the reasons I wanted to start this podcast was because I'd also had that thing where I wanted to talk more about comic books and
Mhm.
superheroes and all this kind of stuff. And it's just, it's tough to find people to talk about that stuff. And it's even harder for me because I live in rural Japan, so nobody knows about that stuff here. Um, and my wife can only put up with me for so long before she just tunes out. And so and that's also one of the reasons why I started the comic book Patreon show as well, so that we could have more discussion of the comics and that kind of stuff too. But like you mentioned, today we are talking about Man Thing, the 2005 version of it. Uh, so I had to track this movie down at a rental store here in Japan, and they've got an app for the rental store. And I was looking on the app and it shows you which stores has the movie in stock and everything. And they also have reviews, and almost every single review of this movie was mentioning the fact that it was not the same as the Werewolf by Night special that had Man Thing in it, and everybody was just so disappointed because it's like, this isn't the same Man Thing. So I thought that was kind of funny that this had spread so far that now people are actively seeking out Man Thing content.
Yeah, I find that really interesting. That's really cool to hear. I think that you know that that Werewolf by Night special is very successful. People really enjoy that. Um, Not so much with this 2005 movie. I know that that's kind of almost
Mm-hmm.
like a forgotten thing. A lot of people forget that that even exists. I definitely don't. I it's something that I try to watch every now and again, every couple of years or something. I think that it's a really interesting movie that kind of stands on its own. But yeah, it's definitely not what you'd expect.
Yeah, it is completely forgotten, and like I told you when you had emailed me about this. Every now and then, I remember that this movie exists, and
Yeah.
I'd never seen it before, but I do remember that it exists, and I had always kept wondering. I'm like, I wonder if anyone's ever going to request Man Thing. I'm like, probably not. And I think I actually just had that thought like maybe a day or two before I got your email. And so I'm like, oh, okay, so someone finally is going to ask to watch this movie. So then I was able to track it down because I'd always been curious about it. I remember back when it was in production, I saw some of the okay. So yeah, like I was saying, I remember seeing articles about it, maybe in Wizard magazine or online or something like that. And I remember seeing some stills of the Man Thing design, and at the time thinking like, oh, that looks pretty interesting. That looks kind of cool. So I was kind of curious about it. And then they said that it was being pulled from the originally planned theatrical release. It was just going to be released and then it ended up being premiering on Sci-Fi Channel, actually, which I don't think I even had cable at the time, so I never actually saw it when it first came out. And then it wasn't, and then just kind of flew under the radar, and never popped up on anything. So I just kind of forgot about it, probably like most people, and only saw it, last night when I picked it up for this episode. But before we dive too much into the movie itself, you had mentioned that you're a big Man Thing fan from
Hmm.
the comics. So tell us a little bit about your introduction to the character.
Yeah, so look, I couldn't even tell you where this comes from, how it was such a big deal to me, other than I remember being a kid and seeing some Man Thing books in my local shop, thinking they looked really cool, and of course, like everybody else, knowing about Swamp Thing first, even though Man Thing was created a few months before Swamp Thing. Still, Swamp Thing always gets all the credit, and everybody,
Mm-hmm.
thinks that that Marvel ripped off DC and created Man Thing as I don't know, a response to that,
Right.
which of course isn't the case. The actual case is that there there's a character called the Heap in an Airboy comic from like the 40s, and that's where both
Mm-hmm.
characters kind of come from. So I think that I just, being really into the monster side of the Marvel universe, and I really liked Hulk a lot. And then I got more into kind of seeing these cool creatures and stuff, these monsters in the Marvel universe. Seeing those Man Thing books, I was just really intrigued by them, started picking them up, and and reading them as a kid, and they're so out there. Of course, we know that you get introductions like Howard the Duck was first in Man Thing books. Some of those that first Savage Tales, definitely isn't for kids, but
Mm-hmm.
but I remember picking that up and reading through it. And then whenever a Man Thing Essentials came out when I was a little bit older, and some of those omnibuses and stuff, just some really, really cool, great stories in there that they really kind of dug deep and really did some crazy off the wall stuff with that really worked. I love Swamp Thing too, but I feel like these two characters are in such a different universe and they tell such different stories, and they're just really, really interesting. So
Mm-hmm.
that's why I'm more intrigued by Man Thing, and that's why I got really into the character. That's why I'm a big fan. I remember, like you were saying, I remember this movie being announced and everything. I can't remember if it was in Wizard Magazine or wherever we got that information from, but I remember it being announced and just being so excited about it. I don't even remember thinking it was going to theaters. I remember hearing it was going to Sci-Fi, and I was like, "Great! I've got Sci-Fi Channel. I'm watching this shit the second it drops." I was so excited about it. So
Yeah, talking about the Swamp Thing connection, because it was
Mhm.
actually, like you said, a lot of people think that Man Thing was ripped off of Swamp Thing, even though you look at it and Man Thing actually came out earlier.
Mhm.
Um, and they both seem to have been drawing heavy inspiration from the Heap, which now is actually in public domain. So
Yeah.
if they just waited a few years, they could have just taken the Heap. um, but and it's really interesting when you look at it, because apparently, so Man Thing was created by Roy Thomas, Stan Lee, and Jerry Conway and
Mhm.
Gray Morrow.
Stanley threw out the name at least. So
Right, Stanley came up with
Look
the
around.
name, and he came up with the basic,
Mhm.
some of the basic origin sketches. Like Roy Thomas said that Stan had called him back in the early '70s, and he had just had a couple of sentences, like the notion of a guy working on an experimental drug for the government,
Mhm.
um, and then getting fused with the swamp and becoming this creature,
Yep.
and that was basically what Stan had given Roy Thomas, and Thomas had kind of ran with that concept and took it a little bit further. But what was interesting is he brought on Jerry Conway to work on it too, and um, Len Wein, who came up with created Swamp Thing.
Mhm.
He was actually rooming with Jerry Conway at the time, so
Yep.
they had probably had um, they just kind of had this. It was like a serendipitous thing where they were both kind of just simultaneously kind of working on the same thing, I believe. And something similar happened with X-Men and Doom Patrol, right? Those are another two
Mhm.
properties that came out pretty much at the same time. People always say, Doom Patrol was a ripoff of X-Men, or X-Men was a ripoff of Doom Patrol, but the lead time for the production back then probably wasn't possible for them to have been ripoffs. It was just one of those weird coincidences that happened.
Yeah. Can you imagine at that time in at least when we're talking about Man Thing and Swamp Thing here, like in the '70s, like that, I guess mid '70s, whatever,
Mm-hmm.
trying to come up with a character designs, origin story, all that, get it to the presses and everything, get it out within months of one another. And then, I mean, I agree with you. I think that there was most likely, they were roommates. So of course they were kind of talking about the projects they were doing. One another was seeing what they were doing, sure, whatever. But I,
Mm-hmm.
I, I think it would be fair to be like, I don't know, here's my swamp creature, here's my swamp creature, and kind of run with it. I had heard too that Marvel did consider taking DC to court over it, but then they knew that it was going to get shot down because of the Heap, so that's why
Mm-hmm.
it was kind of left it alone. But yeah, just
Yeah.
a really interesting thing, a really interesting time to come out with two of those characters that are so similar, but then they're very similar to people who don't read comics. You go in and read the comics, they're not similar at all. They're just swamp creatures. That's the only similarity.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And Thomas had said the same thing. He said, like, after the origins, they kind of diverge pretty
Mhm.
drastically from that point on.
Yeah, very.
Swap Thing, he has his own. They're very different types of characters beyond just the swamp similarities. Swamp Thing is, he's much more human like in terms of sentience and all that kind of stuff. whereas Man-Thing isn't really able to communicate like a human or anything like that. Now I'm
He's like the most
not as
you can be just based on emotion.
right. Yeah. My experience with Man-Thing is I don't know much about his original comics though.
Mm-hmm.
I've read him in other stuff that he's popped up in, like
Sure.
fairly recently. There was I think it was Jeff Parker who did a run on Thunderbolts where he had him as
Yes.
one of the characters in there, and a bunch of other comics he's popped up in here and there, and obviously he was in the Werewolf by Night special. Although I do have the Steve Gerber complete collection, and
Oh, that's nice.
yeah, and I picked those up on one of the Comixology sales a while back. So they've just been sitting there on my Kindle. I'm like, along with like, don't even get me started on how many I have in my to read pile, but it's a lot of stuff. And so I was looking through it, and I was thinking last night after I watched the movie, I'm like, you know what, I want to actually have some more context for the character before we go into this discussion. So I opened up the first volume, which has his first appearance, as well as a bunch of other stories, and started reading it. And yeah, that first issue, it definitely has a lot of the same trappings as Swamp Thing. But then after that, it diverges pretty much. And, there's now the whole thing with, I'm not sure exactly when this happened in the comics, but he ends up being the nexus of realities and is able to transport himself and anyone else and across time and space and all that kind of stuff. So there's that aspect of him too. Whereas Swamp Thing, it's almost like, and I could be wrong here, so you could correct me if I am, but my understanding seems to be that Man-Thing is less connected to the swamp itself, and it's more about the Nexus type thing, whereas Swamp Thing is much more connected to the environment and all that kind of thing.
Yeah, and that would be something that's a little hard to tell if you only saw this movie and you weren't reading the comics. Not to say you personally, but anyone. The thing about Man-Thing is yeah, like you noted at the beginning with his origin story, he's kind of coming up with this next super soldier serum, this next Captain America serum, and obviously I can't remember if it's AIM or whoever. Somebody comes into
it's AIM.
Yeah, AIM. Okay, so AIM breaks into his lab or whatever to take it, and he is kind of like, okay, the only thing I can do is hop out this window and inject myself with the serum and see what happens. That way nobody can get it. And then he does. It's not that he becomes infused with the swamp. I think that is a misconception that a lot of people think if they don't really look into it. It's the fact that, and maybe this was retconned, I can't really remember off the top of my head, but it's that he was so close to that nexus of all realities right there in the swamp that's why it had the effect on him the way that it does. And that's why he is kind of the gatekeeper and protector of the nexus of all realities on Earth. So yeah, just some cool off the wall out there psychedelic 70s stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I could be wrong here, but I think that the Nexus stuff was a retcon because I did not see any mention of it in the original stuff, and that may have been an intentional choice to try and pull more away from Swamp Thing as well. So maybe that was what they were thinking. And that was that sounds like a Gerber idea. So I bet it was Gerber who introduced that retcon.
Yeah, Gerber's got some great ideas.
Oh yeah. I mean, I love his Defenders run is like one of my favorite comics ever.
Mm-hmm.
And that, and I'm saying that without having really read his Man-Thing, other than what I just started reading, or without having read Howard the Duck, which again is also something I've got and will get around to, hopefully at some point before I die.
Talk about out there, yeah. That Howard the Duck stuff is pretty insane.
So yeah, he's an interesting character. He's got a very interesting backstory, and even me going into this movie with only those kind of, much more vague ideas about him, not as well developed. When I was watching this movie last night, the thing that kept jumping out to me throughout it is, well, two things. First off, it's weird to see Rachel Taylor in this because she would go on to play Trish in Jessica Jones.
Sure,
so
he's Hellcat. Pre-Hellcat.
Yeah, she's Hellcat. Yeah, pre-Hellcat. So you could kind of do a mental retcon and say that she was this was before she became Hellcat. Yep. But the other thing I was thinking is that it feels like someone took a generic monster movie script and just kind of laid Man Thing over on top of it, because the stuff about the Nexus, like you said, that's not really in there.
Mhm.
And yeah, Man Thing, he's killed people in the comics, but it's usually some sort of reason. He seems like a bit more, almost kind of just like a traditional monster. He does seem much more like the villain in this movie. um and just like the way his tentacles move. In fact, one of the reviews I saw on Letterbox was pointed out, um you know about whatever the Man Thing touch, fear burns the touch of the Man Thing, whatever the exact line is. And it's like, how can you have that is the character's one thing and you don't use it at all in the movie?
Well, yeah, it's really funny that you say that too, because they took a lot of things that are really important to the character of Man Thing, and kind of threw those out the window. So obviously, the origin story is completely different. This
Mm-hmm.
is now in this movie a Native American, instead of just I mean, Dr. Ted Sallis is just like a normal white dude. He's not like a Native American or anything in his
Mm-hmm.
normal origin story in the comics. So now he's a Native American. Look, that's fine. I don't mind that part. But so there's no super soldier serum. There's nothing about, like you said, the Nexus. That's completely taken out.
Mm-hmm.
The way that Man Thing operates is like you said, whoever knows fear burns at the touch of the Man Thing, or burns at the Man Thing's touch. So essentially, the Man Thing runs on emotion. He
Mm-hmm.
is kind of bothered by like any high emotion. If you're scared, if you're fearful, if you're angry or whatever, then the Man Thing touches you and you catch on fire. Basically,
Mm-hmm.
that's what happens in the comics. It's funny because sometimes you'll see the Man Thing fighting alligators or whatever, and I don't know that anything can be said. I don't know where we stand on if we feel like animals sense fear or whatever, but I at least kind of feel like they do. So sometimes you'll see these battles and there's not really anything happening with the alligator, and then all of a sudden the alligator catches on fire and dies, and
Mm-hmm.
and it's just kind of like an interesting thing that happens in the books. But yeah, one of the biggest things that caught me off guard with this movie was the fact that this takes place in Louisiana.
Mm-hmm.
Man Thing is from Citrusville, Florida. That's where Man Thing exists in the comic books.
Right.
I cannot for the life of me figure out why they decided this needed to be set in New Orleans. It makes absolutely no sense to me. I don't know why they switched that up. Um, but yeah, that was also a very interesting thing that happened in this movie.
Yeah, that's another that jumped out to me. And I believe Swamp Thing is actually, is Swamp Thing set in Louisiana? I think he is.
I cannot remember where
I
Swamp Thing
can't
set.
remember. I believe so, but so that was an interesting thing I noticed too. I also, looking at the appearance, I was looking at the effects on
Mhm.
the Man Thing creature in this, and like the tendrils flying around everywhere, and I'm thinking, I'm like, okay, so it's got the eyes. It looks very familiar, and I was
Mhm.
thinking it looks familiar to the Man Thing, and then I compared it back some, and then when I opened up the book afterwards, I'm like, oh wait, no, the Man Thing in the comics looks completely different. And then I
Yeah,
realized
he's
what it
more like of
was
a
is I
hunched
was thinking
over.
I was thinking of Swamp Thing.
Yeah, Man Thing's definitely more kind of built. I mean, not that this isn't like a big creature, but he's bulkier. He's a
Mhm.
little more hunched over. He has this great big trunk that's his trademark kind of trunk that splits off into threes. Yeah, and this character doesn't have it. Now, don't get me wrong. I think this is a really cool character design. It's a cool looking monster, and it's practical until they add the
Mhm.
CG with the vines and everything coming out, the tendrils or whatever we might call that. So I think that it's an amazing, really cool looking design, but it does not look anything like Man Thing from the books.
Yeah, I remember thinking, I'm like, you know what? Maybe I think what it kind of looks like is it's almost like Swamp Thing with a
Mhm.
beard.
Yeah, yeah, pretty much.
And so now I find myself wondering if maybe this was like a proposed Swamp Thing reboot or something, that then they couldn't get the rights for Swamp Thing, so they decided, let's use Man Thing instead.
Yeah, it's interesting. There's not really enough history or anything, stories about the production or anything out there. I did listen a couple of years ago. There was a podcast that I was listening to. It might have been from comicbook.com, but don't quote me on that. I can't remember. but there was no special features really with this DVD release or Sci-Fi Channel release. So the director came on and did a director's commentary. So he sat through the movie and watched it, and he even stated himself he was proud of this movie and everything, but he had not watched it since it came out. And I guess this was, somewhere around like 10 years later or something. I would say
Mm-hmm.
2015, 2016, something like that. And so as he's going through this, he's talking about how he had a completely different story in mind. And this was at the time, this was 2005. So the MCU was a completely different animal than it became.
Right. Well, it didn't even exist back then.
Yeah, exactly. But you still had your I don't know, Marvel logo right at the front of the movie. This is
Mm-hmm.
I believe this is the first time we see that. I think. Um, I could be wrong, but I don't remember.
No,
Was that
because that would have
the
been
Eric
the
in the
first
Hulk
time.
movie?
The first time was in Spider-Man.
Okay, so this
Yes,
same.
yeah, the flipping
Okay,
pages logo. The first time they had that was in Spider-Man.
okay. So a little bit
X
before
Men.
this.
Yeah, it was after X Men. Then Spider-Man was the first time they introduced it.
Okay,
Pretty sure about that. Either that or it was X Men 2 that was the first one. But it was one of those
okay.
two.
Well, yeah. So this is early on. They're just kind of, I don't know, figuring out what works and what doesn't. But the head of Marvel at that point, Kevin Feige's still involved. I don't think he's the head of Marvel. I think that Avi Arad, is that his name?
Yeah, Avi Arad was like the executive producer on all the pre-Feige
Mhm.
stuff, and he was kind
Yeah.
of running the show. Yeah.
So he had a big hand in this, and he kind of took that what they had in the script and was like, nope, this isn't going to work, and sent it back for rewrites. And
Mhm.
so at the very least, this director is kind of pinning the failure of this movie and what happened to it on him.
Mhm.
So I find that really interesting. I'm not sure. Obviously, we don't have Avi Arad's side of the story, so who knows? But yeah,
Yeah, back then Marvel was in such desperate straits because they had declared bankruptcy in the mid late '90s. It was like
yep.
'97, I think it was, or '98, somewhere around there. And it wasn't until Iron Man that they actually finally got out of bankruptcy. Iron Man was kind of like their Hail Mary to finally get out of bankruptcy. It was one of those types. It was like a do or die situation. It was like,
Mhm.
we're going to try this. If this doesn't work, that's it. We're done.
Yeah, we're
And
screwed. And that was what, 2008,
that was
2008.
2008. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
So like in the early 2000s, after like all throughout the 90s and the early 2000s, Marvel was just licensing out their IP to anyone who was willing to pick it up. That's how we got things like, the Roger Corman Fantastic Four. That's how we got the uh the Generation X TV movie, and
Mhm.
all this type of stuff that was just kind of like churned out. And Blade, even, right? Blade was just like, well, we've got this character, let's just see if anyone wants to do anything with it, and that ended up working out great. And then finally, after sitting on the rights for about 10 years, Fox finally made the X-Men movie. That hit
Mhm.
it big. And then after that, you know, they had finally worked out the rights with Spider-Man. Sony was able to release the first Spider-Man movie. Again, hit it big. And then Marvel just kind of went on a, and that got so many other studios interested. And then all these studios just started going to Marvel. It's like, hey, what else you got? What else you got? And Marvel's just like, oh, we got this, we got this, we got this. And they just kept giving it out to anybody. And the result was, while you have this slew of Marvel movies that came out in the early 2000s of very varying degrees of quality. You had stuff that was, earnest, but, didn't quite hit the mark, like, the director's cut of Daredevil,
Mhm.
or Ghost Rider Spirit of Vengeance, or the Fantastic Four movies. You had stuff that was just, utterly terrible, like Elektra, and it was just, or one of the things that I thought of when I was watching this is, this totally feels like one of those 2005 Marvel movies where it's just kind of, it's there. There's some things to admire about it, but ultimately, I think the biggest sin of this movie is kind of like the biggest sin of Morbius, where it's not bad enough to be entertainingly bad, but it's also not good enough to rise above mediocre. It's just kind of there, is what I felt throughout most of the runtime.
Yeah, it's look, I probably said this 5 times already. It's a very, very interesting movie. It's a very interesting project. It's very interesting that Marvel or whoever would take this property and think in 2005 this is this is something that's going to generate us any type of revenue. Um, I I of course am there for it. I was going to be there for it no matter what because it's Man Thing. So I'm there. But I think the problem is you take this completely unknown character, set it up against a, a very well known DC property that people know and kind of love, whether they like those movies or not. I think is doesn't matter either way. But the name recognition of it. So then you take that and then this wasn't really marketed to anyone. It was a sci-fi channel original at that point. So who's really tuning in to watch this thing? What are other sci-fi channel originals, around the time? They're kind of these weird one and done things that you just kind of catch if you're like sick home from school that day or whatever. Like
Right.
it's not really for anybody. I don't even think they had come out with their big kind of Sharknado type of stuff or whatever they were doing at that, a little bit later on yet. So, so this movie comes out and it's just, it's crazy. It's out there. And then it completely takes the origins and everything about the character. If you read the character and flip it on its head, the only thing that you keep in is the character's name,
Mm-hmm.
uh, the, Dr. Ted Salas's name, who's not a doctor anymore. And
Right. He's a shaman and chieftain now, apparently.
sure. So he's essentially a completely different character. You take away the powers of the Man Thing, like we talked about, and kind of what are you left with? And again, the biggest thing to me, the biggest most glaring thing, you take him out of Citrusville, you take him out of Florida, put him
Mm.
in Louisiana. So it is just a completely different thing. Again, that director was talking about how he had a different movie planned. He had something different in mind. The studio kind of shoehorned in the romance of all of it, which was not
Mm-hmm.
something that was in the original script. Kind of that ending too. He wanted everyone to die, so that was also a studio note. Which that one makes sense. I could understand why you don't want your leads to die or whatever in the movie,
Mm-hmm.
but it needed to end for him on that kind of somber note. Like this Man Thing just kind of went on this killing spree because of what was happening in the swamp, because he was the protector of the swamp, and then the studio took that away from him too. So I can see both sides of the story here. I can see how it fell apart. He had a vision. Now, why he took that vision to Australia, built a giant tank and put a fake swamp in it, and then set it in Louisiana with people with Australian accents trying to do a Southern American accent. I don't know,
Mm-hmm.
but yeah, there's some very interesting aspects of this.
Well, yeah, and also they don't even include any of the characters or even similar type characters
Mhm.
from those Man Thing comics. Like,
Sure, there's
you
no
know,
Jennifer
um,
Hale.
Jennifer Kale, right? There's no
Mhm.
mention of her.
Nope.
She's a sorceress character from Marvel who's shared a psychic link with Man Thing, and then, from what I was reading in the origin story last night, you've got Ellen Brandt, who's posing as Ted's love interest, but she's
Yep.
really working for AIM. Then you've got Barbara Morse, who eventually becomes Mockingbird. You've got Kazar
Mhm.
in there in those early issues,
Oh yeah.
and while you probably can't use all those characters directly. You probably can't have AIM. You probably
Mhm.
can't have Mockingbird. You probably can't have Kazar. But you could probably do Jennifer Kale, and you could probably at least have versions of these characters, even if they have different names, right? So if it's not AIM, it's like some other terrorist organization. If it's not Barbara Morse, then you just come up with some different name and but have her fill in that same role. Oddly enough, I think the original Wes Craven movie actually
Mhm.
seems to be more like Man Thing's origin than this movie does.
Yeah, well, look, this definitely strays completely from Man Thing's origins. I think that's always going to be the question on my mind anytime I think of this movie is why. Why did they feel the need to completely separate it from what it was and make it something completely different? And I don't think we'll ever get really an answer to that. I could see why they weren't able to tie in a lot of those things based on the fact that they changed so much of it. You bring it over to Louisiana, all of this stuff. There, you add in the Native American aspect to it and the kind of protectors of that land. They did bring over one character though, one important Man Thing kind of villain, and that is Frederick Schist. So F.A. Schist, Mr. Fascist. So he is from the comics. So that's a cool character that they brought over, and of course they brought over the director plays. I cannot remember the last name, but Val, who's one of the he's the coroner in the movie, and he is one of famous Man Thing artist. Mike Plug, of course, a famous Man Thing artist, and then Steve Gerber, the photographer there, who's the writer of Man Thing. So they tried to throw in like a little bit of fan service, I guess, here and there, a little bit for us, but they weren't able to tie it into to Marvel, like to the entire Marvel universe. This was very very standalone in Man Thing, and then on top of that, completely flipped on its head too. So
Yeah. So yeah, that's Val Mayerick. I think I'm pronouncing that right.
Okay.
But yeah, that seems to be like the only really thing. Like, I didn't realize about the Schist character, but yeah, the other things, and they also have a photo of Stan Lee on the board of missing people.
Yes.
So that was pretty. But yeah, other than that, they just. It's a weird thing to do when you're like, okay, we've ignored everything about this character, but we'll give you 3 of the creators' names instead. Feels like a weird kind of. That's not really the compromise you think it is. But yeah, and that's why I think I keep coming back to the fact that it feels like this was intended to be something completely different, or at least it feels that way. And then they just kind of slap the Man Thing branding on it. And to your point that you had made before, not really knowing who this movie is for. I was thinking the same thing because, and you're right, Sharknadour came out in 2013, so it was almost 10 years after this. But
Yeah, really.
even still, those sci-fi originals, they've got a certain reputation, right? They're very schlocky, very kind of low budget stuff. And if you're going to go for that, then swing for the fences, right? And the opening, kind of does have a little bit. You got the camper who's naked, who's naked for no reason. The blood splatters all over her chest and all that. So you got some of that, but then after that, sorry,
I can give you a reason for that.
Okay.
So, in listening to the director's commentary there, he said that in order to get this film sold to foreign audiences, it's very, very big in Germany that if you have a movie, especially like a horror movie or any type of slasher, the very first thing they ask is how much female nudity is in it. They're not even going to pick it up unless it has unless it has breasts in it. So he said that's exactly what that was there for.
That's hilarious. That makes sense, but it's weird that it has such a schlocky opening like that, but then the rest of the movie just kind of slows down right after that point, and it doesn't feel like it ever. Because that's what I thought going in, because I knew this movie's reputation, and I thought, okay, well, I know it's basically a low budget horror film is essentially what we're looking at here. And when I saw that opening sequence, I'm like, okay, well, maybe at least it'll be like some schlocky bit of fun or something like that. But it didn't really have that, like that Asylum Sharknado feel to it. And it just felt very kind of bland. And I think, like I said, if you're going to go for something like this, then, and you're not going to have like the big budget to do it properly, and you want to lean into the monster movie aspect of it, then really lean into that. But instead, we get this story with the sheriff who, I mean, he's decent enough. The actor is Matthew Leneves. He's decent enough in the role. Rachel Taylor, she's decent enough. This is her first gig anyway, too. Yep. She does a pretty good job with what she's given, but it's just their story is, the characters are just so blandly written. And you'd mentioned about the romance aspect. Like when that came in, it's just kind of like, okay, I kind of expected this, but I don't see any reason why these two characters would get together.
Yeah, I don't either. And then on top of that, you look at some of the times that they're together, some of the times they're making out or whatever. They're making out right after somebody's killed right in front of them by the Man Thing. They're making out like right after the Man Thing kind of disassembles himself and phases back into the swamp and everything. It's very awkward at these points where they feel the need to just grab one another. It's you can tell it's very forced in the script because it just wasn't there in the initial script. I think that's pretty obvious. And I think if you look, I'm all for having fun. So to me, I definitely don't consider this movie as bad as most reviewers do. A lot of people would say this is garbage and just completely skip it. I wouldn't even say that. I'd say I think this is worth watching. I don't
Mm-hmm.
think that it's a fun time all the way through. It definitely has its ups and downs. Um, I think that if you take it at face value, you can have a lot of fun with it. I think that if you stack it up against Man Thing's origins in the comic books and everything, you're of course going to be very disappointed.
Mm-hmm.
It does a lot of things for no apparent reason, and you're just never going to get an answer to. I was saying before that I listened to that commentary. The main reason I listened to that commentary, I was really hoping that the director would tell us why some of these things happened, why some of these choices were made, especially why Man Thing was moved from Florida or to Louisiana.
Mm-hmm.
And there's just it's not even mentioned. There's no answer to any of that. You're not gonna get an answer. It just kind of is what it is, and you're either along for the ride and having fun, or you're just, hey, this is a bad movie. Stay the hell away from this. There's you can be in one camp or the other, I guess.
I think I fall somewhere between those two.
Mm-hmm.
I agree with you. It's not a completely worthless movie. I think there's a lot of competent things in there. I think it's the direction is pretty good. It's pretty well shot. The performances, we get, like I said, we have some decent performances from Rachel Taylor, from Leneves, um, blanking on one of the other guys too, but uh, Steve Bastoni. He was also not too bad. I thought he was pretty convincing in it. When you get some of the villains in there, like the Thibodeaux, then they just kind of get over the top, and then you start getting into like,
Well, they're like cartoon characters, yeah.
yeah. I mean, I was thinking about like the yokels in like Texas Chainsaw Massacre or Friday the 13th or something like that, but. And that's why it almost feels like this movie doesn't really know what it wants to be. It doesn't know if it wants to be that kind of like schlocky horror film or if it wants to be something that's aiming to be something more serious. It's like this
Mhm.
weird middle ground. It's like, pick a side.
Yeah, and I think a lot of that has to do with the rewrites. The director did say that this was just a completely different thing, but what I do gather from that being a completely different thing is that it still wasn't going to be a good thing either way. It's not like he had a good idea in mind and it got changed to something bad. This was going to be bad in a way either way. Again, it's just how you look at it whenever you go into it. If you want to have fun with it, or if you want to just say this is absolute shit, that's kind of up to you. And that's what I think that we do with a lot of movies or a lot of media that we consume. Look, for me personally, have sat down no less than 6 times and tried to watch the Matt Reeves Batman movie, and I can't make it 30 minutes in. It's to me, it's like unforgivable. I can't even watch it. Now, this is like a highly acclaimed film that a lot of people really love, and they think that Matt Reeves did a wonderful job and Robert Pattinson is wonderful in the role. And then you have me, who's not trying to be pretentious and act cool or anything. I can't make it through it. It's not connecting to me at all. It's dark and it's not going anywhere, and it's just I hate it. But that's that's probably me sitting down. Like I said at the top of this episode, I'm not a Batman guy, so it's hard for me to go
Mm-hmm.
in sometimes. Now, the Christopher Nolan trilogy, I can sit through. I got no problem with. All those 90s Batman movies are super fun. I have no problem with any of those. I can watch the Batman animated series. Something about this newer incarnation just isn't for me. And I think that can happen to a lot of people for a lot of different reasons. But you take something like this, and you have to remember this is a low budget movie. This is
Mm-hmm.
not your Hollywood MCU movie. This this is a very low budget movie, and a lot of this movie was spent on, or a lot of the budget for this movie was spent on recreating a swamp that's supposed to look like it's in Louisiana over in Australia.
Mm-hmm.
They completely had welders, they had builders, all these people out creating these giant, massive tanks and filling them with things to make it look like a swamp, which look pretty cool, but it doesn't look like an actual swamp.
Mm-hmm. No, I get what you're saying with that. I mean, there are definitely some movies like that I'm with. I mean, you know, a lot of people love the Snyder cut of Justice League. I despise that movie.
Yeah,
It's just so fucking,
it's a rough
to
watch.
me it's just like it's just so fucking long,
Mhm.
and it doesn't really, and it's needlessly long. It feels like it's just, it feels like he's just masturbating on screen actually for a long stretch. And so yeah, I totally get that. And I mean, I love the Batman, but the the Dark Knight Rises, like I think I'll be very satisfied if I go the rest of my life and I never see it again. I don't need to see it again. So
Yeah.
I definitely, and there are movies also that other people despise that I think are completely underrated. Like I
Mhm.
mentioned, the director's cut of Daredevil. I will defend that movie to my grave.
Oh man, I love Daredevil.
Yeah, and a bunch of other ones too that I think So yeah, it's that whole thing about opinions are like assholes. We all got them, and they all stink. So,
Yes.
but yeah, and I couldn't, and like I said, I don't think this is completely worthless. My whole thing going into it was just I didn't feel that it was bad enough to be entertaining, and it wasn't
Mhm.
good enough to be entertaining. It was just this kind of like bland middle. Like you know, if you have a nice cooked steak that's it's cooked really well, it's nice and pink on the inside, it's got nice flavor into it, or if you've got something that's just been burnt to a crisp, right?
Mhm.
Either way, you're gonna have an experience. This is just something where it's like it's a well done steak, but it's not bad enough to be like, oh my god, I got to tell you about this worst steak I ever had type of thing. But it's not enjoyable either. It's just kind of like there. And that's why I actually compared this movie to Morbius, because Morbius kind of disappointed me, not because I expected it to be good, but
Mhm.
because I expected it to be spectacularly bad. And then I watched it and I thought it was just boring.
Yeah,
And I
it's
had,
just there. It's not memorable enough for you to
right.
really even comment on it. That's yeah, I completely agree with you on that. This is again, this is a it's in between for me as well. It's a fun watch, but it's also hard to watch. I find
Mhm.
myself sitting there for 20 minutes kind of really intrigued, and then after that I want to pick up my phone and start seeing, what's going on in the news or something, and then and wait for something out of the corner of my eye, wait for Man Thing to show up or something like that. It's a hard watch. It's still fun. It's all over the place. It's a really,
Mhm.
really weird movie. It's a weird experience.
Yeah, and I was comparing it in my head to the Wes Craven Swamp
Mhm.
Thing too, because that movie has its flaws. It's definitely not a perfect movie by any stretch of the imagination, but there's a certain charm to that movie,
Mhm.
um, that it just feels like this movie doesn't quite have. And there are other superhero movies like that too. I mean, the Amazing Spider-Man 2 has a lot of problems with it, but there's a certain charm to it because you got Andrew Garfield, you got Emma Stone in there, and just the charm of those two alone makes you want to sit through the bad parts of that movie.
That's
There's not an
I love that you bring up the Amazing Spider-Man because that's a whole different ball game or whatever, a whole different topic, but that's kind of the same thing if you think about it. It's something that really, like, Andrew Garfield should never have been Spider-Man, Peter Parker. Like, he doesn't work in that role, but at the same time he's so cool and I just want to see him as Peter Parker because I really like him a lot.
Mhm.
But he's not Peter Parker. He's not Tobey Maguire. He's not he's not Tom Holland. He doesn't have that same energy that they bring out as Peter Parker, but he's so cool and I just want to watch him in the role. I don't know. I'm so conflicted by it.
You know what? He feels more like Ben Reilly.
Uh-huh.
I mean, I think if you did a Scarlet Spider movie and had Andrew Garfield, I think that would be perfect because he does feel a lot more like Ben Reilly. I was thinking about this the other day, actually. Um,
Yeah, and I'd love to see him somewhere else in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. I know we had a little bit of him in the last Spider-Man movie,
mhm,
but God, I would love for them to cast him as somebody else because he's just so cool. I just want to see him more
mhm.
in these movies. He's such a cool actor.
I'm still waiting for Emma Stone in a Spider Gwen movie.
Oh, that would be great, but
that
I
that
think
that's still
that,
what I'm
I
waiting.
don't think
That
that's
Yeah, I
going
don't
to
think
happen.
we're ever going to get that, but I'm still I'll be holding out hope for that until the day either she dies or I die. uh, but yeah, and it's just this movie. It doesn't have enough going for it to really keep me interested through those bad parts or through those slow parts.
Oh yeah,
I mean, it's
definitely.
one thing if you had really intriguing characters, but the characters are just out of stock horror movie characters.
Hmm.
It's one thing if you had inventive death scenes or something like that, but you know, you don't really have any of that, and and even like some of the themes, there are some interesting themes that this movie kind of introduces, like, the idea of, you know, taking over native lands and all that kind of stuff,
Mhm.
or, corporate exploitation of small towns, or just like the pollution of the environment. All of this are really interesting ideas, but they never go anywhere. They just kind of sit there.
that
Sorry, go ahead.
No, you're good. You're good. I think that that's another really interesting part. They kind of they don't go anywhere with these themes. They don't know kind of what they want to do with them, and you have some of these characters that some of these half baked ideas that could be really interesting. I think before I was talking about the sci-fi original stuff like Sharknado and stuff like that. You have to think to yourself, Sharknado, sitting through a whole Sharknado movie, it's kind of the same thing. You want to see all the crazy shit go on with the sharks and stuff like that, but the stuff in between where the characters are sitting there talking or whatever, like those are the boring parts, and that's the same thing here. This is the boring parts of this movie. This is what really suffers and makes it, less than a B movie or whatever, with this really low budget, without, any really good editing or anything going on, without anyone taking a second look at that script and saying, hey, this doesn't work. This doesn't narratively make any sense here. This needs to be cut out. You can tell a lot of that's missing. And a lot of this was just kind of the director going back and forth with Avi. I can never say his name.
Avi
Avi
Arad.
Arad. Okay. Yeah. And kind of what was happening back and forth there. I think it really, really suffers from that. But again, I can't say for certain that this would be a better movie without any interference, because it sounded like he didn't really have a plan either way.
Yeah, and just from what you'd said, it sounds like he wasn't someone who was interested in the source material,
Mhm.
or interested in finding out about the source material, because you can have someone who maybe doesn't come in a fan, but they're interested enough to do their research and do a pretty decent job. I mean, Bryan Singer, the fact that he's a monster aside, he came in the X-Men movies, and he wasn't a fan of the X-Men, but he read up on it, and there's still plenty of criticisms to have about those movies, but for the most part, I think he got more right than he got wrong, at least
Yeah.
with the original movies. Let's not talk about Apocalypse, but again, that's another story.
The greatest movie ever made. Come on, why not?
Oh, we're gonna start a fight here any minute.
Uh,
But then you've got other directors who, they come in as a fan, and
mhm,
maybe they're too much of a fan, right? So someone like Mark Steven Johnson with Daredevil and Ghost Rider, or Tim
mhm.
Story with the Fantastic Four. You can tell they're obviously like the stuff, but they're they're not able to get over their fandom, and to really they're more concerned with, like, oh, wouldn't it be cool if we did this, but they're forgetting about the fact that, yeah, but you got to have a good story that's going to appeal to more people. And that was kind of a problem with a lot of those movies. And then you've got, this, where you bring in someone who, probably similar to Josh Trank, who doesn't seem to be a fan of the movies, doesn't seem to be a fan
Mhm.
of the comics, and just kind of wants to put his own stamp on it, and doesn't really care about what this character is to other people.
Yeah, it was so interesting and eye opening to listen to that commentary track. I really suggest that anybody do that if you can. Again, I'm not selling it too well because I don't even remember which podcast it's from, but it was just really cool to listen to hear his side of it, because yeah, like you're saying, I never heard him really express any interest in the character. I never heard him really express any interest in working on a Marvel project or anything like that. It was just kind of another paycheck to him. Now, what I did hear a lot of was that he was really, really intrigued with Australia and wanted to go on vacation to Australia. And that's why he set up shop in Australia and convinced the studio, to take it there because it would cost a lot less and whatever. And he really ended up staying there for 5 years after this movie. There was nobody checking up on him other than him like sending the script and then dailies or whatever. So it's really interesting. What kind of comes across is like, hey, I just wanted to go out to Australia and they kind of paid me to do that, so that's what I did. I ended up staying there and making a few other movies. This is the same guy that made Virtuosity and the Lawnmower Man. Like, he's
Right.
not uh great at adapting other people's passions into a film. I think that some of it looks great. I like the cinematography, some of the cinematography and some of the
Mhm.
stuff. I'm not going to say all of it. And obviously he likes to work with, like, the cutting edge technology at the time, the computer animation and all of that on Lawnmower Man that looks interesting as hell. But then again, what they did with practical and then CG effects here in this movie. So it's such a mixed bag for me. There's so many bad things to say about this, and then there's some good things that I really like too. That's what kind of drew me to it. That's why, look, I'm not going to lie to you. I didn't even look through your list of movies of what had been done and what hadn't been done. I just sent in, let's do Man Thing. I guarantee that no one has ever suggested doing this movie and you haven't covered it. So
Yeah, and you were right.
it's just an interesting movie. I feel like it's something to talk about. It's definitely, it's not my favorite movie, but like I said at the head of this, it is something that I go back to. I do try to continuously watch this, at least every other year or so, just so it's kind of fresh on my mind. I was really happy, and I haven't gotten your spin on it yet, but with the Werewolf by Night special, with the depiction of Man Thing on that, I think it was really cool. It was really interesting. It was really nice how they brought him in as a secondary character in this, and he really, I'm not going to say stole the show, because I feel like Elsa and the
Jack.
werewolf, yeah, really, held their own too. But this kind of brought the character to a lot of people's attention. A lot of people were trying to learn more about Man Thing. If you look at any of the recent sales on Savage Tales 1, or even Man Thing Volume 1 number 1, Man Thing Volume 2 number 1, they've really gone up. Even that those Adventure into Fear books and everything really spiked after this, and they're really holding as well. So it's a character that has been brought to a lot of people's attention now, and they're very interested in at least collecting and then learning more. So I think that there's obviously something there with the character. But yeah, you're right. This director wasn't able to bring that over in his vision at all. He kind of just made something that seemed like the script to something else, and then just kind of laid this on top of it. I wouldn't be surprised at all if that's actually what happened.
Yeah, I mean, because that's exactly what it feels like. Now, as far as Man Thing and Werewolf by Night, I loved it. Like, I was not expecting that at all, and so when he
Mhm.
pops out there, I'm like, "Holy shit, it's a fucking Man Thing!" And
Yeah.
like me, like I said, I'm not even a big fan of the character, but just seeing them, pop up out of screen, I'm like, "It's fucking Man Thing. It's the giant
Mhm.
size Man Thing." And my wife, she was like, What are you? What's wrong with you?" And I'm like, It's Man Thing." I'm like, "Don't forget it. Forget it. This
Mhm.
happens all the time." But yeah, I thought it was great, and for me, actually, I thought he did steal this show because,
Mhm.
I mean, I like Marvel's horror characters. Werewolf by Night, interesting enough, but I wasn't that intrigued by the idea of the Werewolf by Night special. I thought, oh, this is kind of cool, but I wasn't like, oh, I'm so looking forward to this.
Mhm.
And so when I watched it, I'm just like, yeah, let's go along, see what it is. And then once Man Thing popped up, that added a whole new spin for me that got me really a lot more invested in it. So he definitely stole the show for me. But your point is taken though. Like Bloodstone and Jack definitely held their own too. Um, and I think, yeah, that character is definitely kind of blown up from just that appearance because, like I said, even here in Japan, all the reviews on the, the rental site for this movie was just like, this isn't the same Man Thing. What the hell is this?
Yeah, it's so interesting to take something like this Werewolf by Night special and see what they did with the character. They didn't focus on the character. They didn't make him the central point, but once he was involved, everyone was very intrigued by him. Everyone's very invested in what was going to happen to him. They even kind of did something different with the Man Thing here, and he refers to him as Ted, which is really cool. It kind of shows their relationship outside of
Mm-hmm.
that. He's just this hulking monster man thing or whatever. He knows him as Ted. He knows them as Dr. Theodore Salas, and I think that spin was really cool. I really hope that there is a future for Man Thing in the Marvel Cinematic Universe in some way or another. And I think that Marvel's smart enough to at least kind of exploit the character a little bit, do something a little bit more with them, with all the hype. But like you said, there in Japan, people are talking about the character, comparing the character to what happened in this movie. and yeah, there's no way you can even set these two against one another. The way that Man Thing is depicted in the Werewolf by Night special is completely night and day as to what happened here in Man Thing 2005. They really screwed you know
Mhm.
up everything. They screwed up his whole origin. They everything that they could possibly do wrong with Man Thing, they did wrong. I still
Absolutely,
have fun
yeah.
with the movie, but this is not a Man Thing movie.
No, I mean, and yeah, there's validity to that. Like, there's something to be said for movies that are bad adaptations, but you still like them anyway. I mean,
Hmm.
the Keanu Reeves Constantine movie is a perfect example of it. It's a
Yes.
terrible adaptation of John Constantine, but as a movie in its own right, it's entertaining. It's a
Yeah.
fun movie.
Yeah, it's definitely a fun movie. I'm with you on
I
that
mean,
one.
and there's a bunch of other ones too. Um, Spirit of Vengeance, right? I mentioned Ghost Rider Spirit of Vengeance before.
Hmm.
Not a great Ghost Rider adaptation, but that is a damn fun movie. It's a pretty fun ride. Uh, but yeah, and that's why and that's again I keep coming back to this idea that it just feels like they're, you know, nobody, he doesn't really know who this movie is supposed to be for. And I think part of it is, I think you kind of hit the nail on the head when you talked about how he wanted to go to Australia. I think he was just kind of doing this as a way to get to Australia, and that was it.
Yeah, it looked like a $7 million vacation, and that's
Hmm.
kind of what it was. He made some friends. I mean, almost that whole commentary is just talking about these actors that he worked with, these friends that he made, how he just had such a wonderful experience in Australia. Everything was about Australia. Now, why would you take something that takes place in a swamp,
Hmm.
somewhere that doesn't have a swamp? Like, what would be the purpose of that? Now, you could easily, I mean, I don't know, I don't understand filming well enough to understand things like tax credits and stuff like that. I understand that that plays a big part in things. Obviously, paying actors in the states probably costs a lot more than paying actors in Australia, where
Hmm.
I don't know, they don't have a Hollywood scene or whatever or the same kind. So I could see how that's probably more easy to convince a studio to do or whatever. But yeah, you're taking these central points of what makes the character, these people that are in the South, and you're taking Australian actors who have to learn a Southern accent on the fly and who break it a lot. I remember the first time watching this movie, and all I could think was, what are these accents? They're going in and out of a Southern
Hmm.
drawl. Like, they have a little bit of it there, but then it breaks, or it's just not quite there. They don't get it all the way. The only character I can really recall that really kind of nails that is the Frederick Schist character. He's kind of able to nail that accent in a way, and then the other characters really just go in and out, especially the secondary ones. Especially,
Hmm.
you've got that character whenever the sheriff is first being escorted over to the swamp area, and he's in the boat, and he says, "Why is it called the Bywater?" And he goes, "Because it's by the water." And that was a fun little line. But yeah, even that character just went in and out of his Australian accent. So just
That
some
line,
wild
that line
stuff.
struck me as just him. He was writing the script, and he was just like, "I got to think of a name for this place. Oh, I got this great idea for a joke."
Yeah, and it's a great joke. That's a good dad joke. I like it. I'm a fan. But yeah, I can't find myself in any situation where I'd be able to reuse it. So I got to take points off for that.
I mean, I will say, like you had talked about Man Thing, what his role might be in the MCU going forward. I mean, we are getting Secret Wars, and he's the guardian of the Nexus of Reality, so I think there's definitely something we could tie in there. Um, Another thing too is this is just my personal thing, but a few years ago, Marvel did a Howling Commandos comic book
Yes.
with a bunch of the monster characters. It had Dum Dum Dugan, who was it was the same mind, but his mind was basically in an LMD body, so it's just like completely robot body, but his mind is still Dugan's mind. He was leading this team of monsters, and Man Thing I think was in that lineup too, and it was such a fun series, and I'm like that would be so cool to do. Like, you can get Man Thing in there, you can get Jack Russell in there. Bring back Neil McDonough, have him play Dugan again. I think that would be a really cool MCU project to see, and
Yeah, and
that's
I
like
think there's
what I would love to see.
yeah, I think there's definitely a way to continue to have Man Thing in the MCU without focusing on a solo film. I think that obviously that's something that's not going to happen. I don't think there's really any hope that we would get another Man Thing movie. This was really the only shot at that, I believe. But
I mean, you
throwing
never
it,
know. We got an Eternals movie, so
well,
you know.
sure, sure. But the character's been introduced, and like you said, throw him in on a team. There's a lot that he can do uh, in a team. There's a lot he can do in Secret Wars. Uh, he can be involved with champions. There's just a lot that that
Oh
that
yeah,
man.
well, yeah, I'd mentioned the Parker Thunderbolts. They're doing Thunderbolts now. That's definitely
Yes.
somewhere else he could pop up too.
Yeah, absolutely. Even if just, small little parts or whatever. I feel like there's definitely a future for Man Thing in the MCU, and I hope that we continue to see some of that. I think that would be really cool. I I had always kind of proposed this anytime I talk about the future of the MCU, and whenever we were waiting on the news from James Gunn and whoever else is in charge of DC right now to come out with their slate and everything, there's a lot of superhero fatigue right now, at least that people talk about. I don't know how
Mhm.
true it is because box office money still speaks
Yeah.
and everything, but a lot of people, you have a lot of these acclaimed directors coming out against the machine that is the MCU, against superhero movies. You have Martin Scorsese, you have Quentin Tarantino, kind of saying their whatever they think. Their old man speech about how movies aren't the way that they were back in their day and all of that. Um, and a lot of people are saying there's a lot of superhero fatigue out there. Again, a lot of people are saying that something like She-Hulk and Miss Marvel was bad, but yet you look at the ratings for them and they're rated pretty high. Whatever. I loved all of those
I
projects.
love both of those. Yeah, She-Hulk was probably my favorite of the
Yeah,
Disney
exactly.
Plus
Watching
shows
that
to
stuff
date.
week to week was amazing. It's just like reading a
Mhm.
comic book and waiting for the next one to come out. I loved it, but whatever. If it's just the trolls on the internet or whatever, then that's what it is. But a lot of people are saying that superhero fatigue exists, is my point. And if it does exist, if people really are tired of these projects and tired of seeing these things, well, what have we not explored yet? And what does the DC universe and the Marvel universe both have, like, in mass? Like, they have so much horror, they have so much sci-fi, they have so much stuff that's not superhero related at all that they could
Mhm.
do something with. My take was, why doesn't DC come out swinging with their horror stuff? Why don't they come out with some of this witching hour tales of the unexpected, Swamp Thing, which they are, which I applaud them for the Swamp Thing and calling it, a horror project and everything. But why not take a different angle? We've already seen the Trinity a million times. I don't need
Mhm.
Batman, Superman, and Wonder Woman again. And unfortunately, as different as everybody thinks that what James Gunn and company have announced here, it still involves Superman and Wonder Woman and Batman, whether it's Elseworlds or not. So it's still the Trinity, and yeah, there's some deep cuts there with Creature Commandos and some different stuff. But I just felt like, why not just come out swinging on a completely different angle? You have so much IP that you could do something with that's not superhero related. If you've really got a good idea and you have some good story behind it and good actors behind it and everything, you don't need that name recognition of Batman, Superman, Wonder Woman. We don't need the Avengers on the Marvel side. Like, we can do something different.
Well, I mean, I think Marvel's proven that. Like the name recognition now isn't necessarily with any of the characters. It's with that Marvel brand is what the name
Yes.
recognition is now. I mean, I see, I teach university here in Japan. I see, young university co-ed students walking around in like Marvel sweaters. And
Mhm.
I've asked some of my students like, "Oh, you like Marvel?" And they'd be like, "Oh, no, I just like I like the logo." I'm like, okay, so but it's ridiculous. I'm seeing, when I was in college, I wish there were cute college girls walking around with Marvel shirts, but it never
Oh
happened.
god, yeah,
But
exactly. Or even Marvel shirts at all. But
yeah, yeah. I mean, but it's that is the brand now, and I think Marvel has proven that people will give anything a try if that Marvel name is on it. I mean,
Mhm,
everyone thought Guardians of the Galaxy was going to be Marvel's first big flop. It ended up being one of its biggest successes.
mhm.
Um, uh, you know, Eternals, didn't do that great, but it still did respectable. It didn't fail completely. Shang-Chi as well, right? That's, who outside of comic book fans even have ever even heard of Shang-Chi? And that did really well too. And, all these types of projects that everybody's like, oh, this is going to fail, this is going to fail. And they end up being successful. I mean, to the point about superhero fatigue, I think a lot of that is just a prime example of Twitter is not real life, right? Because I see that all the time with, people have been saying that for, I remember seeing headlines about that back in the mid aughts when people were saying, are people tired of superhero movies? And obviously not, because now it's, almost 20 years on and we're still getting superhero movies. And, the directors, my late co-host pointed this out, because we had talked about it when the Martin Scorsese stuff first came out. And he had pointed out, and he's like, notice how every one of those articles, the director is talking about some new film they're promoting. And he's like, I think that's what this is. They're like, they want to talk about their new film, but they know the way to get people to click on the articles is by bad mouthing superhero movies. So that's why they do it.
And that makes a lot of sense. Those are that's the clickbaity stuff. If you're interviewing Martin Scorsese, if you're interviewing Quentin Tarantino, if you talk to any of these people who have no stake in the game, there's never a chance that they're going to make a Marvel movie, so they can burn whatever bridge they want or whatever. But
right.
Yeah, you kind of say that. What do you think about the Marvel movies? What do you think? Of course, these high cinema, pretentious filmmakers have to say something. They can't just say, hey, it's cool that people like it, it's not for me or whatever. They have to kind of come out against it and against that form of art, call it not cinema, whatever. But yeah, I think you're completely right. That's an angle that I hadn't really looked at before. It must be clickbait. It must be a way to generate views to their article so they can push their product, and less about what is going on with superhero movies or Marvel movies.
I think another part of it too, and it's a similar thing with like Alan Moore. Every time Alan Moore comes out bashing superhero comic books, and someone pointed out on Twitter, I think it might have been Dan Slott, who said, why do you people keep asking Alan Moore about superhero comics? It's clear he doesn't want to talk. Just stop asking him.
Sure.
I think that's probably part of it too. And I think that's why Alan Moore's answers get more and more combative, because he's just so sick of hearing the same fucking question. And I think that might be that could also be an element of too, why you keep hearing, Martin Scorsese or Coppola or any of these other people bashing superhero movies, just because they're like, I don't want to fucking talk about it. I mean, like, you guys like whatever you want, but just stop asking me about it. And so when they're asked about it constantly, they're like, fine, fuck it. I'll give you the answer you want to get clicks. But you do make another good point there where you said that it's a way to show something different with the superhero genre. And I've long maintained this myself. I think that the key to superhero movies, it's that you don't look at superhero movies as a genre in itself, which may be kind of contrary to the thesis of this show, I realize, but you look at superheroes as kind of like window dressing for other genres. And, and I think Marvel kind of really hit on this when they started out with some of their movies. Like, you've got Iron Man, which is a standard superhero origin film, but it's also a lot more focused on the tech side of stuff. And then when you got, I think the first Avenger was really the first movie that they really kind of hit on this. And they're like, no, it's not. It's a superhero film. Yeah. But more than that, it's a pulp World War II adventure.
Yeah.
And
it's something completely different. Right.
And then when they did the second one, they're like, well, he's not in that pulp setting anymore. So now we're going to make it a modern day political thriller. And I mean, those two movies are just both great movies. They both have there's a lot of consistency between them, but tonally they're very different. But it works because they stick to those different approaches. And I think I will say this for this movie. This movie was one of the first that really kind of leaned into that idea. Let's take this superhero concept and put it in a genre film. And, other movies have done this to varying degrees before, but I think they really leaned into it. And I think of its era, I think this was the first movie that really kind of heavily leaned into it. It's like, we're not making a superhero movie, we're making a horror movie. And, even though it's, I think we may differ to the extent, but I think we'll both agree the execution didn't quite live up to that premise, but I can admire the attempt. at,
Hmm.
at that. I can admire the idea behind it of let's take this superhero concept and put it into a horror movie. And in some way, maybe this did, and this has been proven true because then we got stuff like Brightburn, which I thought was a great movie that took that superhero concept and put it in a hardcore, very entertaining horror film, and it was great.
Hmm. Yeah, and I think that I could even cross this over into something like, look, to me this even feels more like a slasher movie than a horror movie. It's
Mm-hmm.
got a lot of those elements to it. I can definitely put it up against something like Friday the 13th. 13th. Not saying that it's as good as Friday the 13th or anything like that, but it shares a lot of those elements to me. It seems more like a slasher type of thing, and I think there's a place for stuff like that. I think that it's very hard. We have something like Marvel under the Disney banner. We have DC Studios under the Warner Brothers banner. It's going to be hard to take any of that stuff to that extreme anymore, to have like a hard R rating on anything or whatever. um I think that there's a place for that. Now, maybe you have to exclude some of the nudity that was in this movie or whatever, and just stick to killing and stuff like that. I think there's a place for slashers in the MCU somewhere. I don't think
Mm-hmm.
we'll really evolve to that point. I don't think we'll get that again, but I would like to see that. I would like to see some real horror. I think that I was really, really disappointed, and not in the movie. I think the movie was wonderful. Doctor Strange 2 in the Multiverse of Madness. I love it. But I remember it coming out. I remember it being announced, and it was pegged as, this is horror. This is going to be the first installment of a scary Marvel movie. And while I love the movie, it's not that at all. It's not scary. It doesn't even dip into horror at all for me in the slightest bit.
I said there's some attempts there, but it definitely doesn't go far enough. I will
Mhm.
definitely agree with you on that. I mean, you could definitely see Sam Raimi leaning into some of his horror influences. And if you're going to get someone to direct a more horror type Doctor Strange movie, I mean, Sam Raimi is really the perfect guy to do that. He's right there in that that's right. That's like his like dream project right there. That totally combines like, his love of superheroes, which he clearly has from the Spider-Man movies, but also his love of horror. And yeah, it was a little bit disappointing too for me because I also was kind of hoping we'd see him lean in more to the horror aspect. Maybe, I mean, hopefully we'll get him to do a third Doctor Strange movie, and
Mhm.
maybe that one can be more like Guardians 2 or Black Panther World of Wakanda, or Wakanda Forever, where it's not as tied to the overarching plan, and maybe then we can get something that's a little bit more horror infused. I think would be great. Um, and I think there's definitely room for that harder R stuff. I mean, and again, Joker. I wasn't the biggest fan of Joker, but again, it did make that attempt to do something different with the superhero concept, and that
Mhm.
was a pretty, that was a pretty intense movie. They leaned in pretty well to that R rating. You got the Deadpool movies, and they weren't at Disney at that time, but Marvel is pretty committed to keeping them in the same tone as those first two movies. So I think there's definite room for this, and I think we could see more of it. There are certainly some characters that could fit in that vein. Um, it's a shame Sony still has the lock on Venom, because I think that is a perfect place where you could easily do that.
Yes.
Uh, Depending on what we see next with the Punisher, that's something else where we could lean into more of that. Um, Taking it back to this movie, I was also clocking those slasher movie tropes a lot,
Mhm. Mhm.
and even down to the fact that there's so many bland characters. That's such a trope of slasher movies.
Yep.
And but the thing that kept pulling me away from this is, in a slasher movie, you've got to have at least one character that you have some attachment to.
Mhm.
Um, or you've got to have very inventive death scenes. Otherwise, the audience is just going to lose interest. And I don't feel like this movie really had either one of those.
Yeah, I think some of the kills visually looked kind of stunning. I think that I do believe that they did a good job with that, especially given the budget and everything. The way that the kind of vine tendrils came out of the man thing and stabbed through people, and especially that end kill.
The oil one, I did like that one. That one I
Yeah,
did like, yeah.
that was a nice kill. I think, yeah, as far as inventive, yeah, not really. There's not much there. They did look kind of cool on screen. But again, that gets us away from the entire point that really you had everything already built in. all Man-Thing had to do was basically go up and touch one of these people and catch them on fire, and that's what was supposed to happen. But instead, we got something different. I can't comment on that. There's nothing I can say. I don't know why that happened. I don't know why that was different. But
Yeah.
Other than maybe that was just a note that happened, or maybe like you said, maybe the writer director there wasn't even familiar enough with the source material that he just kind of was like, okay, here's vaguely what the character looks like, and he lives in a swamp, and okay, he kills people, cool. It could have been that too, given the budget. Maybe there wasn't much research involved in it or whatever, and it was just kind of out there. But yeah, I think that I like this as a pointless slasher. I like this as just a dumb, fun, like kind of horror-esque movie. It's not really scary, but yeah, it's fun enough for me to watch.
Yeah, I don't see myself going back to this movie anytime soon, but it wasn't definitely an interesting topic of conversation. So I will give you that. But we're pretty much at the end of time now. So Daniel, why don't you tell people where they can find you?
Yes, please check me out on wherever you get your podcast from. We're on Stitcher, Overcast, Apple, Google, Spotify, Anchor, wherever. That is all new, all different, number one comics. That is my comic book podcast. If you want to hear me and my co-host Bob talk about comic books, and if you want to hear me talk about some more movies, I do a bi-weekly podcast with a friend named Jer, and it is called Real Good Movies with Jer and Dan. And that's real, like a movie reel, REEL, because we're just that clever. Yeah, and you can find that anywhere as well. The comic book podcast is also on YouTube under the comic book channel, where I post the podcast and then my weekly comic book hauls as well. So yes, please check me out. Give me a rating or review, whatever you can do, and I would greatly appreciate it.
Yeah. We'll have those links in the show notes, so people just go and click on those, and they'll be able to find those easily. But Daniel, thanks so much for coming on. Thanks for finally giving me an excuse to watch this movie that I'd been curious about for a while.
Yeah, thank you for having me on. Greatly appreciated.
I'm glad to have you. Anytime you want to come on back. But that does it for this episode of Superhero Cinephiles. SuperheroCinephiles.com is the website. We are Super Cinema Pod on Twitter and Instagram. And remember, if you sign up for our Patreon, patreon.com/Super Cinema Pod, you get these episodes a week in advance. And you also get access to the Patreon exclusive Superhero Cinephiles book club, where we talk about comics and graphic novels. Thanks so much for listening, and we will talk to you next time. If you enjoy the Superhero Cinephiles, then you'll also love my companion podcast, the Superhero Cinephiles Book Club. All my Patreon subscribers get access to this exclusive podcast where I review superhero comics and graphic novels. Not sure what comics you want to read next or what you should dive into? I've got you covered on that. I'll be doing reviews, recommendations, and also talking to you about useful entry points if you're interested in reading some comics but don't know where you should start. Plus, you'll get access to all episodes of the main show a week before everyone else. On all of this for as little as just $1 a month. All you have to do is go to patreon.com/supercinemapod, and you can sign up at any subscription amount to get started. Thanks so much for your support, and please don't forget to rate and review us on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts.
Thank you for listening. And as always, good night, good evening. God bless.